They say laughter is the best medicine. But what if it turned out to be the most contagious virus the world has ever known? Welcome to What If Horizons, the podcast where we don't just bend reality. We tie it into a balloon animal and send it to therapy. Today, we're diving headfirst into a world where laughter isn't just an involuntary reaction to cat videos, bad puns, or your uncle's holiday sweater. No, in this version of Earth, laughter is a highly contagious, unstoppable, society-warping virus. And let me assure you, it's no joke. It began, as most pandemics do, with a single event. Not a laboratory leak or a bat in a wet market, but a pie. A coconut cream pie hurled across a wedding reception by a drunk cousin with surprisingly good aim. It landed squarely on the groom's face just as he was giving a heartfelt toast about trust and eternal commitment. The guests burst out laughing. Not chuckles, not giggles, howls. From that moment, they couldn't stop. Ambulances were called. Not because anyone was hurt, but because guests were laughing so hard they couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't remember their names. The bride divorced him mid-honeymoon, citing unrecoverable snort damage. The first scientists on the scene believed it was psychosomatic. Mass hysteria, maybe, until they started laughing too. One by one, researchers, reporters, even military escorts sent to contain the emotionally unstable crowd fell victim. It wasn't the content, it was the contagion. Like yawning, but with hysteria. Laughing triggered more laughing. And when laughter became airborne, everything changed. Masks were useless. People laughed through them. Face shields fogged up from tears of mirth. Hand sanitizer was replaced with breath mints, under the mistaken belief that minty freshness might halt the spread. Governments issued statements urging calm, but every press conference dissolved into awkward chuckling as officials tried to suppress their own grins. Entire parliaments collapsed into wheezing fits mid-legislation. Epidemiologists called it endorphin syndrome. Virologists called it contagious positive feedback loop disorder. The media settled on the term giggle flu. Social media, with its characteristic restraint, dubbed it the Holocaust, which was immediately condemned, but trended for weeks. It didn't take long for the world to fall apart in the most absurd way imaginable. Airports became unusable. Flight crews couldn't maintain control while cackling mid-takeoff. Newscasters attempted to read headlines about economic collapse while barely keeping a straight face. Courtrooms fell silent, not from reverence, but from defendants openly mocking the charges and judges wheezing uncontrollably at their own gavel mishaps. You couldn't go outside without being exposed. A toddler's infectious giggle on the subway would shut down an entire line. Church sermons were replaced by open mic comedy nights, not by choice, but by necessity. If the preacher started talking about sin and someone snorted, game over. Worship turned into stand-up. Humorists were treated like biological weapons. Comedians were detained and questioned. TikTok creators who lip-synced over movie clips while dancing in banana suits were banned under international law. Dad jokes were classified as Class B biohazards. The phrase, "pull my finger," was a felony in 3 countries. Worst of all, no one could finish a sentence. Conversations collapsed under the weight of escalating giggles. People walked around with cue cards just to communicate without triggering an outbreak. Some chose to remain indoors, sealing themselves in laughter-proof bunkers lined with old tax documents and unfunny German literature. But there were also those who thrived. The meme lords, previously relegated to the digital gutters of comment sections, now ruled. With one captioned cat photo, they could level an entire municipality. Governments tried to regulate them, but memes mutated faster than they could be filtered. Irony became currency. Sarcasm a weapon. Still, not everyone found it funny. There emerged a resistance, the Stoics. They believed in stone-faced stoicism, solemnity, and silence. They held vigils where no one was allowed to smirk. Their motto, "He who laughs lasts not." They wore gray, ate tofu, listened to Gregorian chants play backward. Their greatest fear? Dad puns. Their worst enemy? TikTok. And yet, despite their efforts, the virus spread. Hospitals overflowed, not with the sick, but with people who pulled abdominal muscles from prolonged laughter. Surgeons struggled to perform operations while nurses giggled at the beep of the heart monitor. Therapists couldn't treat trauma without both parties collapsing into laughter over Freudian slips. The UN convened an emergency summit. The Secretary General's address began with "Let us be serious," followed by 5 minutes of uncontrollable snorting from all 193 delegations. A new treaty was signed, not to curb war, but to limit puns in diplomatic negotiations. Meanwhile, scientists raced to find a cure. A vaccine was proposed, made from the tears of accountants. It failed. Another was tested using suppressed giggles from British aristocrats. Also failed. Finally, they turned to children, the original carriers. In a bold experiment, they asked a group of preschoolers to watch a mime fail to climb an invisible ladder. The resulting wave of laughter cracked seismographs across 2 continents. At this point, it became clear this wasn't just a virus. It was evolution, and this was just the beginning. As society lurched into its new, uncontrollable hilarity, people began making serious adaptations to this unserious world. Schools, for example, had to radically reinvent themselves. Traditional classrooms were abandoned. Chalkboards had become lethal joke amplifiers, and teachers found themselves unable to finish a single sentence without inadvertently setting off a chain reaction of giggles that would spiral into full-blown classroom meltdowns. The new educational model became what experts called laugh and learn, which essentially meant lessons were delivered in a format suspiciously similar to improv night at a poorly lit bar. Math was taught through slapstick. One popular lesson involved launching pies at a grid of numbers while calculating trajectory, velocity, and custard viscosity. History class was indistinguishable from a satirical news show, with students role-playing major events like the signing of the Magna Carta while wearing fake mustaches and speaking in accents that would get them banned from any serious theater company. Science, of course, was taught with volcano simulations using soda bottles and increasingly exaggerated expressions of mock terror. The scientific method now included a peer review step involving banana peel placement and comedic timing. Colleges tried to resist the change. They clung desperately to seriousness, to theses and tenure and Latin mottos nobody really understood. But when the dean of a major university broke into hysterics during a commencement speech, caused by a graduate's extremely unfortunate surname being read aloud, all hope was lost. Professors soon embraced the new reality, delivering lectures with sock puppets and mandatory pratfalls. Of course, not everyone adapted so easily. Certain professions began to struggle in a world where a good pun could derail hours of work. Airline pilots, for example, had to undergo daily desensitization therapy just to maintain composure during turbulence. Bankers attempted to transition to no-joke banking zones, but those failed the moment someone realized the term fiscal cliff sounded hilarious when said with a hiccuping giggle. And then there was politics. Political campaigns, once driven by slogans, platforms, and occasionally well-hidden bribes, were now gladiatorial arenas of stand-up routines. Debates were judged not on policy, but on comedic timing. Candidates hired comedy writers. Entire political movements were built around punchlines. One particularly effective slogan, "Make taxes fun again," was delivered alongside an actual rubber chicken, which the candidate then used to solemnly tap the podium during discussions of healthcare reform. In this world, truth became secondary to timing. News anchors were replaced by late-night comedians. Breaking news was now broken with impeccable comedic delivery. Satire and reality became so blurred that even historians weren't sure if certain events had happened or were just part of a particularly good monologue from 2 years prior. Religion, too, underwent seismic shifts. Traditional structures found themselves competing with the emerging cult of laughterism. Its central tenet? That the universe was not only absurd, but meant to be absurd. Followers gathered weekly in amphitheaters, wore brightly colored robes covered in joke buttons, and worshipped deities like Chuckles, the god of delayed punchlines, and Snortia, the goddess of inconvenient laughter. Sermons were open mic sessions. Sacred texts included comedic screenplays and annotated transcripts of sitcoms long forgotten by the pre-giggle generation. But deep beneath the surface, something darker brewed. Not everyone wanted to live in this kaleidoscope of absurdity. The Stoics, those early adopters of resistance, had grown in number and sophistication. No longer just tofu-eating minimalists, they had weaponized seriousness. Their base of operations? a gray concrete fortress known as the Sobrietarium, where laughter was forbidden and emotions were filtered through grayscale filters. They communicated only in monotone. Their anthem was the sound of a filing cabinet being closed. Twice. They believed the virus was not evolution, it was sabotage, a cosmic prank gone too far. They claimed humanity was on the verge of becoming a parody of itself, incapable of discerning tragedy from comedy. Their underground broadcasts included slow readings of instruction manuals and dramatic reenactments of waiting in line at the DMV. Their leader, a former performance artist named Malcolm Drain, was known for his legendary 14-hour silent monologue titled Sigh. While they grew in influence, the world above giggled its way toward chaos. Advertising became pure madness. Every product was now sold via parody jingle, ironic testimonial, or satirical TikTok campaign. Billboards featured memes instead of messages. Even prescription medication commercials, once deadly serious, were narrated by cartoon characters who burst into song halfway through the side effects. Entertainment had no limits. Reality TV morphed into hyper-reality comedy combat, where contestants were thrown into absurd scenarios, blindfolded job interviews, interpretive dance traffic stops, philosophical rap battles, and scored based on how many other participants they made snort uncontrollably. Award shows were hosted by holographic versions of classic comedians, and speeches always ended in pie fights. Social norms mutated. Weddings were judged by the quality of the comedic vows. Funerals included roast sessions. Birth announcements came with viral prank videos. Even breakups were accompanied by slide decks of humorous reasons for the split, complete with sound effects and dramatic reenactments by sock puppets. At first glance, it all looked like an explosion of joy, a society freed from the grip of melancholy, thriving in a new age of mirth. But the cracks were beginning to show, because no one could stop laughing, even when they wanted to. People were starting to suffer from what psychologists reluctantly dubbed chronic hysterical burnout syndrome, or CHBS, pronounced chubs, because of course it was. It turned out that constant laughter, while wonderful in moderation, was like chocolate cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Delightful at first, but eventually corrosive to the soul and highly inflammatory to the diaphragm. Hospital beds were filling with patients suffering from ruptured abs, jaw dislocation, and in extreme cases, spontaneous pants sweating brought on by particularly well-timed punchlines. Relationships were also feeling the strain. Imagine trying to have a serious discussion about commitment, mortgages, or the inexplicable smell in the fridge, only to have both parties dissolve into fits of laughter before the first sentence is complete. Arguments became stand-up duels. "Why didn't you take out the trash?" was met with, "Because I'm building a sculpture of our love from garbage," followed by uncontrollable snorting. Divorce lawyers rebranded as comedy mediators, offering services like mutually amusing separation packages and joint custody with laugh tracks. Religious leaders, once the bastions of solemnity, had either abandoned their posts or gone fully theatrical. One prominent televangelist replaced fire and brimstone sermons with satirical monologues delivered from atop a unicycle while juggling flaming rubber chickens. He claimed divine inspiration, though others suspected he just enjoyed the costume budget. Baptisms were now water balloon fights. Confessionals included rimshot sound effects. A new religious sect emerged, called clownicism, where parishioners wore red noses and interpreted scripture through knock-knock jokes. Workplaces fared no better. Board meetings began with slapstick routines to get it out of the system, but often derailed before the first slide. Bosses attempted to implement serious hours, which only led to covert pun wars in company chat threads. Productivity plummeted. One multinational firm tried to adopt a laugh quota, after which employees were docked pay for excessive giggles. Within a week, half the staff quit and formed a startup called Haha Incorporated, dedicated to turning office stress into parody musicals. Then came the real catastrophe, the justice system. Judges were traditionally immune to nonsense. Their black robes, stern expressions, and dramatic gavels had long been society's last defense against madness. But laughter spared no one. A high-profile trial collapsed when the defense attorney attempted to present alibi footage and accidentally played a blooper reel of the suspect trying to explain time zones. The entire courtroom, including the stenographer, broke down for 47 minutes straight. The final verdict was delivered in interpretive dance because no one could speak without giggling. Law enforcement suffered too. Police tried to maintain order using laughter neutralizers, videos of spreadsheets and budget meetings, but criminals adapted. Bank robbers wore novelty wigs and performed choreographed skits during getaways. Graffiti artists became performance satirists. Even hackers started leaving ransomware notes written in limericks. Meanwhile, the Stoics, those gray-clad guardians of grimness, continued their silent crusade from beneath the streets. They recruited disillusioned nurses, accountants, and burned-out stand-up comedians seeking refuge from the epidemic of joy. They believed the world had tipped too far into absurdity, and that seriousness must be restored, even if it meant weaponizing boredom itself. Their greatest creation was the silence engine, a machine that could dampen laughter through a mix of bureaucracy, poorly designed PowerPoint presentations, and monotone recordings of tax code readings. They tested it on small towns, where the local population suddenly reported experiencing meetings so dull, they forgot how to smile. One farmer described the sensation as like trying to laugh in a dentist's waiting room while your Wi-Fi is down. But the rest of the world kept laughing. Laughter had become not just common, it was compulsory. Those who didn't laugh were viewed with suspicion. "You don't find this funny?" became a loaded accusation. People began faking laughter to fit in, leading to an epidemic of what doctors called faux giggling fatigue, characterized by dead eyes and a forced ha-ha every 8 seconds. It was as if humanity had become a massive, twitching laugh track. In entertainment, this reached peak absurdity when the Oscars were replaced by the Laughies, an award show where actors were judged not for their performances, but for their ability to deliver lines without breaking into fits of laughter. The most prestigious prize was Best Snort Under Pressure, awarded to a man who managed to deliver a eulogy scene in a zombie comedy without peeing himself. And then, just when the world thought it had adjusted, something changed. The laughter began to mutate. It wasn't just joyful anymore. It became eerie, unnatural. People reported laughing at things that weren't funny, at tragedies, accidents, moments of genuine grief. A woman watching a fire consume her home burst into uncontrollable giggles. A man at his father's funeral laughed so hard he had to be sedated. News anchors chuckled while reporting disasters, their faces strained, eyes wide with silent panic. The virus had evolved from comedy to compulsion, from satire to sinister mimicry, and the world, once joyfully ablaze with hilarity, began to realize it had become a prisoner to its own laughter. Laughter, once the gift of the gods, or perhaps their most elaborate prank, had now become an ever-chattering parasite lodged in the collective human psyche. It no longer waited for jokes, nor did it care for wit or timing. It erupted at funerals, job loss announcements, even when people stubbed their toes. It was no longer catharsis. It was reflex. Humanity had become the punchline of a joke no one remembered telling. Doctors scrambled to understand what was happening. Neurologists discovered that the parts of the brain responsible for humor were firing nonstop, overriding other cognitive processes. The limbic system was in overdrive. It wasn't just dopamine, it was a torrential, ecstatic flood drenching everything else. Memory, logic, impulse control, all drowned beneath wave after wave of spasmodic chuckles. What had once been joy was now seizure. Psychiatrists began to whisper of giggle psychosis, a condition in which the subject becomes detached from reality, consumed by the need to laugh. Patients would sit for hours watching static on televisions, cackling as though they'd just seen the greatest comedy routine ever written. Families tried to intervene, staging humor-free interventions involving colorless rooms and paperwork readings. It worked, for about 5 minutes. Then someone sneezed, and all hell broke loose again. Social media, that grand amplifier of every human flaw, had become an unsalvageable feedback loop of memes, ironic misfortune, and people performing increasingly unhinged stunts just to keep up with the collective hysteria. The most popular channel in the world was a man who simply walked into things: walls, doors, cacti, angry livestock. His followers were in the billions. His income? Staggering. His sanity? Questionable. In politics, governments had all but surrendered. World leaders no longer gave speeches, they performed bits. Parliaments turned into open mic venues. Bills were passed via rap battles. The UN General Assembly met monthly in a rotating comedy club in various international cities, their most recent session ending in a pie-throwing standoff between three nuclear powers. The resolution passed unanimously. Thou shalt not bomb, only roast. The economy had reinvented itself entirely around humor. Forget commodities, services, or even digital currency. The global economy now ran on laughter. Quite literally, scientists had developed a system to measure the intensity and frequency of laughs, which was then converted into a quantifiable unit known as the habuck. You earned habucks by making others laugh. Some were born wealthy. Others practiced for hours, rehearsing pratfalls and perfecting puns. Clown academies became Ivy League institutions. Old money families, replaced by elite lineages of comedians, each with their own signature style and patented gags. But there were warning signs. Rumors. Whispers of entire towns going silent overnight. Not from seriousness, but from burnout. Places where people had laughed so much, so hard, that their bodies simply couldn't take it anymore. Faces frozen in smiles, lungs collapsed, eyes dried from perpetual tears. Some said they died happy. Others said they'd just forgotten how to stop. Emergency crews entering these zones wore soundproof suits and carried monotone devices, reading from spreadsheets and stock reports to bring the laughter under control. Still, the infection spread. The arts were not immune. Novels could no longer be tragic, or even neutral. They had to be parody. Music had ditched sincerity for satire. Even classical orchestras began to add comedic elements, violinists tripping mid-solo, or sudden kazoo interludes in Beethoven. Theater was renamed the comedium, and Shakespeare? He was rewritten entirely in knock-knock joke format. No one questioned it. To question was to risk being labeled a joy blocker, the gravest social offense. And yet, in secret, the Stoics advanced their counteroffensive. Their underground movement had become global, complete with unmarked concrete outposts in cities across the globe. Their ranks had swelled, bolstered by ex-comedians, recovering influencers, and a small but growing sect of monks who had taken vows of anti-humor. These monks wore robes of ash and practiced meditation by reading traffic laws aloud. Their mantra was a flat-toned repetition of "This is not funny. This is not funny. This is not funny." The Stoics' master plan centered around the unfunning. It was to be a global broadcast event, serious, sterile, unrelenting in its dullness. An antidote of sorts. A 24-hour feed of beige walls, unsalted crackers, tax tutorials, and extended footage of grass growing. No music, no voiceover, no smile. Just pure, industrial-strength tedium. They believed that if they could bore humanity back into balance, perhaps the neurological hyperlaughter would subside. The date was set. The world braced for the most profoundly unentertaining broadcast in history. But something happened before it could launch. A child in Belgium, unremarkable in every way except for the fact that he had somehow never been infected by the laughter virus, asked his parents a question. A question so simple, so sincere, and so completely devoid of irony that it rippled outward with seismic intensity. He asked, "Why are we laughing if we're not happy?" And for the first time in years, millions of people stopped. Not for long, not all at once, but for the briefest moment, the laughter paused. Eyes blinked, heads tilted. A silence began to spread, fragile and trembling like a deer in a minefield. And in that silence, something unexpected bloomed, reflection. Real, serious, uncomfortable reflection. And for some relief. Not everyone welcomed the silence. For many, it was a terrifying sound. They had lived so long within the bubble of constant laughter that stillness felt like suffocation. It was as if the absence of noise exposed the very thing they'd been laughing to avoid, the creeping void of meaninglessness underneath. Some tried to laugh through it, forcing chuckles into the cracks, but the echo now felt hollow. The laughter no longer soothed. It revealed. Governments panicked. Without laughter, productivity dropped. But this time not from distraction. People simply stopped working. They sat at their desks, stared at their screens, and blinked slowly like confused goldfish. The absurdity of their roles, of their rituals, of their routines, all became glaring under the stark light of sobriety. What was this spreadsheet for? Why was Karen still sending 3 a.m. emails about font sizes? Who even ordered that pallet of logo-branded stress balls? Entertainment industries imploded first. Audiences stopped tuning in. Sitcoms that once scored billions of habucks were now met with grim silence. Talk show hosts stumbled through monologues that once drew standing ovations, only to be met with quiet sighs and the occasional moan. Social media influencers wept openly as their laugh reacts dropped to zero. Their content, once the bread and circus of the masses, now lay barren, soulless pixels offering nothing to minds seeking more than giggles. Some tried to adapt. One popular influencer rebranded as a meaningfluencer, offering slow, monotone readings of Dostoevsky and posting time-lapsed videos of her watering a single fern. She gained a cult following of 12 people, all named Jeff. It wasn't glamorous, but at least she wasn't trying to juggle flaming cupcakes on a unicycle anymore. The economy entered what economists gingerly called the humor recession. With the habuck deflating, new forms of value were proposed. Thought coins, mind shares, and sincerity credits became hot topics, though most were scams. Desperate financiers tried to reignite the giggle bubble with artificially generated laughter farms, massive data centers filled with synthetic chuckles harvested from AI that had watched every sitcom since 1952. But the laughter lacked soul. It was off, like canned laughter echoing in a church. Meanwhile, the child who started it all became a global enigma. News anchors, philosophers, and desperate late-night hosts tried to reach him for interviews, but he remained elusive, shielded by parents who, shocking everyone, valued his privacy. All the boy had done was ask one question. He had no manifesto, no follow-up, no monetized podcast. Just an innocent observation that hit the world like a metaphysical defibrillator. Academics and thinkers seized the moment. The Great Reflective Era, as it was later dubbed, began. Libraries reopened. Philosophy courses exploded in popularity. People actually started reading books, physical ones, with pages and everything. Some even wrote in margins with pens. Bookstores, once museum pieces, became bustling hubs. Cafes transformed into salons. Suddenly, asking difficult questions was cool again. What is joy without sorrow? What's the value of authenticity in a world obsessed with optics? Is it okay to laugh at banana peels if society itself is slipping? The Stoics, unexpectedly, found themselves out of work. Their broadcast, the unfunning, became redundant. Instead of needing forced boredom, people craved real, messy human experience. Not everything had to be a punchline anymore. The Stoics disbanded and opened a quiet chain of tea shops called Pause, where phones were banned and all conversations had to include at least one uncomfortable truth. Not everyone adjusted well. There were factions of resistance, laugh extremists who believed the silence was a disease. These radicals, dubbed the cacklers, would burst into public spaces to scream laugh in an effort to reignite the viral hysteria. But their timing was off. Their jokes stale. Their punchlines sharp as butter. They became parodies of themselves, tragic clowns with fading makeup, trying to revive a carnival that had already packed up. Still, humanity did not lose its sense of humor entirely. No, it simply evolved. Laughter became rarer, yes, but also more valuable. Earned. When it happened, it mattered. A well-timed joke at a funeral, whispered with love. A snort during a thesis defense. A chuckle in the middle of a protest. These laughs didn't distract, they connected. They didn't numb, they reminded. They weren't symptoms, they were signs of life. People began telling stories again. Not just jokes, but full, layered stories. Tales of hardship and hope, irony and tragedy, missteps and meaning. Podcasts bloomed, long-form essays returned, and stand-up comedy morphed into sit-down sincerity. Intimate sessions where comics told the truth, then slipped in the punchlines like little candy-coated bombs. And in all of this strange rebirth, the world quietly thanked that nameless child. He had reminded them that laughter was never meant to be the destination. It was a path, a delightful, dangerous, beautiful path through the absurd maze of human existence. And so we enter the strange middle chapter of humanity's reckoning with uncontrollable laughter, the cultural aftershock. Like all addictions we barely understood, the world was suffering from what could only be described as a withdrawal, not from a substance, but from an emotion we'd overdosed on. It wasn't that laughter disappeared, but it ceased to be a reflex. People began to realize how much of their lives had been structured around the expectation of humor. Entire relationships were built on shared memes. Careers had been forged on irony. Even parenting manuals had once recommended tickling as a conflict resolution method. In offices once filled with snorting and chuckling, a curious silence now stretched across cubicles. Managers awkwardly tried to initiate team-building exercises that didn't involve improv games or wearing funny hats. It didn't go well. Human resources quietly updated their protocols to include laugh-free engagement strategies and replaced their ping-pong tables with silent reflection pods. No one knew what to do in them, but sitting quietly became a badge of emotional maturity. At the governmental level, the change in tone was dramatic. Parliaments and senates that once operated like chaotic comedy clubs were now eerily calm. Politicians began to speak in complete, unpunned sentences. One senator gave an entire speech without a single zinger and was nominated for a Peace Prize. Press conferences turned into earnest dialogues. It was almost as if, brace for impact, people were listening. International relations, surprisingly, improved. Without sarcasm clogging diplomatic channels like cholesterol, countries could actually say what they meant. Agreements were clearer. Treaties lasted longer. And for the first time in decades, a ceasefire wasn't accompanied by a viral meme of a pigeon wearing a helmet. But of course, not all consequences were benign. The dating scene, for instance, was in absolute shambles. Without jokes to fall back on, first dates became interrogations disguised as conversations. What are your emotional triggers? Replaced, what's your favorite pizza topping? Apps had to recalibrate their algorithms to reward vulnerability over wit. One particularly popular dating app, Sincere, only allowed users to post painfully honest bios. Sample profile: recovering validation addict with trust issues and a mild obsession with historical naval disasters. Seeking someone who doesn't use laughter as a defense mechanism. Shockingly, it worked. People were falling in love again, not with personas, but with people. Then came the wave of artistic transformation. Filmmakers abandoned comedic timing and leaned into storytelling with jagged edges. Sitcoms evolved into dramedies, then into surrealist confessionals. Stand-up specials became therapy sessions where audiences clapped not at punchlines, but at painful truths finally spoken aloud. One show featured a comedian who simply read her diary entries from age 13 to 30 while intermittently crying and occasionally smirking. Critics called it a seismic shift in the genre. It was also, confusingly, sponsored by a yogurt brand. Comedians themselves had the hardest time adapting. Some vanished from the spotlight entirely, unable to navigate a world where punchlines were no longer currency. Others rebranded as empathy architects, hosting workshops on narrative vulnerability. The few who survived the transition were those who'd always known that comedy wasn't just about laughter, it was about connection. They tapped into something deeper, messier, and more human. Laughter returned in their performances, yes, but now it was interwoven with tears, silences, and the raw awkwardness of life's unedited footage. Schools adjusted their curriculums. Intro to humor was replaced by emotionally intelligent communication. Detention became group journaling. Children were taught to differentiate between joy and escapism. They learned how to sit with discomfort, how to share stories without needing a laugh track, and, most radical of all, how to be bored without imploding. Generation Giggle, as they were once called, became Generation Depth. But deep within this collective transformation, a new problem was emerging. A quiet panic. If laughter had once shielded us from pain, and now pain was exposed, what shield would replace it? Enter the cult of Stoic Serenity 2.0, a splinter group from the original Stoics, who believed humanity had swung too far in the opposite direction. Their motto: life is not for pleasure, but precision. They wore grayscale uniforms, only consumed flavorless food, and communicated via data summaries. Emotions were to be acknowledged, never indulged. They proposed legislation to ban metaphor. Poetry was declared a high-risk activity. They sought to sterilize existence itself, to eliminate the very chaos that made laughter necessary in the first place. This sparked an unlikely alliance. Comedians, philosophers, grieving parents, awkward teenagers, confused middle managers, and former meme lords all stood together and said, No, not everything needed to be hilarious, but nor did everything need to be dissected into stoic statistics. They rallied in public squares, performing rituals of imperfect joy, messy dances, stories with no punchlines, hugs that lasted a bit too long, and songs sung slightly off-key. The media called it the human renaissance. It was neither utopia nor dystopia. It was something far stranger. And in that strangeness, people began to laugh again. Not because they had to, but because sometimes, when life is just absurd enough to feel real, laughter sneaks in through the cracks like sunlight through broken blinds. And you don't need a punchline. You just need to feel alive. But being alive, as it turned out, was an increasingly complicated business in the post-laughter age. For starters, entire industries built on the assumption that humans craved amusement were collapsing faster than a stand-up comic with stage fright. Theme parks rebranded as reflection zones. Comedy channels quietly transitioned into reality acceptance networks, and morning talk shows tried replacing banter with meditative silence. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well. Watching two perfectly coiffed anchors nod silently at each other for 3 hours while a ticker scrolled news of mild traffic congestion and existential dread wasn't exactly ratings gold. Yet amid the wreckage of forced chuckles and abandoned clown shoes, something oddly beautiful began to sprout. An ecosystem of intentional absurdity. Yes, intentional. If laughter was no longer involuntary, then why not craft scenarios so delightfully ridiculous that even the most emotionally constipated stoic might snort? Artists took the lead. A performance piece titled "Banana in a Suitcase, Crying Gently While Yodeling" drew massive crowds. No one knew what it meant, but halfway through, an elderly man laughed so hard he knocked over a donation bowl. It was hailed as a breakthrough. Even governments got in on the movement. Denmark declared the third Tuesday of every month Absurd Day, where citizens were encouraged to wear shoes on their hands and file tax returns in the form of limericks. Brazil adopted public silliness zones, allowing citizens to break into interpretive dance during work meetings. The French, in true existential fashion, protested the loss of irony by organizing silent marches where each participant carried an inflatable flamingo and a copy of Camus. Science, too, had evolved. Virologists partnered with psychologists to study the mechanics of contagious laughter. They dissected giggles, graphed guffaws, and published research papers with titles like Hysterical Pathways in the Amygdala, a meta-analysis of snorts. One team in Finland even developed a wearable device that played a barely audible laugh track to gently coax joy back into social settings. Side effects included spontaneous belly laughing in elevators and emotional confusion during funerals, but the project was deemed a success. Meanwhile, in the underground corners of the internet, the meme warriors had regrouped. No longer wielding cheap punchlines, they became the avant-garde philosophers of the absurd. Their posts were cryptic. A turtle in a suit holding a briefcase, captioned, "When you're early to a meeting that doesn't exist." No context, no likes, just the gentle hum of a world trying to remember how to be silly without being shallow. But as society crept back toward laughter, it faced its most difficult question yet. What if we didn't want the old kind of laughter anymore? Because, let's be honest, much of it had been weaponized. Laughter had been used to belittle, to exclude, to distract. Late-night monologues that once felt cathartic now read like passive-aggressive manifestos. Satirical news had become indistinguishable from actual news. And beneath the shiny veneer of humor, too many people had been crying quietly, their pain masked by emojis and laugh reacts. So the new laughter had to be different. Softer, wiser. Like an old friend who shows up uninvited but brings your favorite tea and listens to you talk about your weird dreams involving sea lions and unpaid parking tickets. Communities emerged that specialized in laughter re-education. Not jokes, but joy. They practiced laughter yoga, not as a gimmick, but as a return to primal release. They told stories without punchlines, and then laughed anyway. They built giggle gardens, public parks with soft moss, confusing sculptures, and unexpected tickle spots. They didn't promise happiness, just relief. Honest, momentary, bubbling relief from the unbearable weight of being. One particularly popular movement, known as the Chuckle Covenant, emphasized slow laughter. No more rapid-fire gags. No more 10-second dopamine hits. just the gradual swell of shared absurdity. Members would meet in small groups, stare at each other in silence for a few minutes, then each share the dumbest thing they'd ever done. No mocking, just celebration. You lost your passport in a lasagna? Incredible. You once mistook a stranger's purse for a trash bin? Iconic. You sent your boss a text meant for your therapist? We've all been there, Karen. And through it all, children, those original carriers of the laughter virus, led the way back. Not through contagion this time, but through connection. They laughed without needing irony. They giggled at shadows, at farts, at the word kumquat. They reminded adults that not everything needed meaning. Sometimes, joy was its own justification. Eventually, even the boy who had started it all, the one who'd asked why we laughed when nothing was funny, re-emerged. Older now, quieter, but no less curious. He didn't give interviews, didn't write a book. He simply showed up at an open mic in a community center and told a story about getting his shoelaces stuck in an escalator while trying to impress a girl. The story had no moral, no dramatic twist, just him, flailing in slow motion while the escalator dragged his dignity toward oblivion. And people laughed, not because it was polished, not because they were told to, but because, for a brief moment, they saw themselves in the ridiculousness of being human. And that, at last, was enough. The laughter virus, once feared as a social catastrophe, had evolved, or perhaps, more accurately, society had. What started as a biological outbreak had transformed into a philosophical reckoning. The world wasn't infected anymore. It was enlightened, albeit through a very peculiar path paved with awkward chuckles, cringeworthy confessions, and a healthy dose of secondhand embarrassment. And yet, despite this new age of mindful mirth, there were still holdouts. Entire enclaves of people insisted that laughter was a dangerous distraction, a gateway drug to complacency. They wore serious expressions like bulletproof vests and greeted each other with a solemn, "May your truth remain unblemished." Their towns had names like Stoicville, Realiton, and Gloomington. Smiling was permitted, but only with proof of an approved reason, like witnessing a double rainbow or achieving fiscal responsibility before the age of 30. But for most of the world, laughter had settled into a new, humbler role. Not the star of the show, but the scene-stealing side character who appeared just when things got too heavy. Families rediscovered it around dinner tables, not through canned jokes, but through the raw silliness of everyday survival. Someone dropping a spaghetti strand on their lap and declaring it a tragedy of Roman proportions. Grandpa attempting to use voice dictation and accidentally sending the word pants to the family group chat 17 times. Little things, big laughs. Technology, predictably, tried to monetize the laughter renaissance. Apps popped up with names like Haha Sync, Snort Chain, and Tickle Me GPT. Most failed miserably. Turns out, when laughter becomes authentic again, people grow suspicious of anything designed to simulate it. One app claimed to use AI to generate soulful chuckles based on your emotional profile, but was banned after it told a grieving widow a knock-knock joke involving necromancers. There was one notable exception, a decentralized social network called Guffaw. Its only feature? Users could upload moments that made them laugh uncontrollably. No captions, no filters, no algorithms. Just videos of pure, ugly, glorious, human laughter. A toddler chasing a balloon until he ran into a couch. A man trying to do yoga with his cat sitting on his face. A woman in her 60s absolutely losing it while trying to parallel park. It became the most visited platform on Earth within a month. Not because it was perfect, but because it was ridiculous in the way that life itself is ridiculous. Religions also had their say. Theologians debated whether divine laughter was blasphemy or a blessing. One monastic order claimed that God's first utterance after creating the universe was a chuckle, as he watched gravity introduce itself to a very surprised apple. Another group declared that enlightenment could only be achieved through the perfect belly laugh, one that shook not just the diaphragm, but the soul. Their chants sounded suspiciously like sitcom theme songs. No one minded. Meanwhile, philosophers were in absolute chaos. The epistemologists argued that laughter was a coping mechanism for the unknowability of existence. The ethicists insisted that laughter required moral scrutiny. Was it ethical to laugh at someone slipping on ice if they were okay afterward? The metaphysicians had a field day. claiming that the sound of genuine laughter was proof that we weren't living in a simulation, because no AI would ever invent something so pointless and perfect. In schools, history classes included the Great Giggle Crisis as a case study in unexpected global shifts. Children learned that joy, like language or fire, had evolved in stages. There was the primal stage, laughing at farts; the tribal stage, laughing at others' misfortune; the industrial stage, weaponized sarcasm; and then the post-viral stage, laughter as healing, rebellion, and, perhaps most scandalously, honesty. And somewhere in this strange new normal, businesses try to catch up. Corporate training materials replaced team synergy with emotional resonance. Zoom meetings open not with icebreakers, but with confessionals. Tell us something embarrassing from this week that reminded you you're not a demigod. And people would, with alarming vulnerability. One CEO admitted to crying in a walk-in freezer because he dropped a burrito on his foot. The stock price went up. In fashion, trends shifted from power dressing to play dressing. People wore mismatched socks not as a political statement, but as a reminder to not take themselves so seriously. Suits were out. Pajamas were in. T-shirts with terrible puns made a comeback. One bestseller simply read, "I came, I saw, I forgot what I was doing." But underneath all the culture shifts, beneath the new art and old fears, there remained a single thread connecting everyone: the desire to be seen without needing to perform. Laughter was no longer applause. It was recognition, a secret handshake between souls who understood that the world was beautiful and stupid, often at the same time. And as this understanding spread, it touched even the most unexpected corners of life. Funerals, for example, began to change. Yes, funerals changed. Once solemn parades of hushed whispers and awkward tissue rustling, they became, dare we say it, celebrations of exquisite absurdity. Not that people stopped grieving. No, the pain of loss was still there, sharp and silent as ever. But people began to honor their dead not only with tears, but with the kind of laughter that hiccups through heartbreak and somehow makes the ache gentler. Mourners would stand and recount not only the noble accomplishments of the departed, but their dumbest, most wonderfully human moments. Like the time Uncle Roger glued his own hand to a garden gnome, or when Grandma accidentally joined a biker gang thinking it was a crochet club, or that one time Dad tried to deep fry ice cream and nearly summoned a minor kitchen deity. And instead of organ dirges or somber string quartets, people played audio recordings of the deceased laughing, their real, belly-deep, messy laughter, the kind that reminded everyone they were once gloriously alive. One funeral featured a montage of the dearly departed snorting milk through her nose while watching soap operas. Another had guests do stand-up routines in tribute, each one beginning with, "Well, if Dave were here, he'd be roasting all of us right now. So here's my revenge." Oddly enough, cemeteries got livelier. Not literally, this isn't that kind of podcast episode. But laughter had infected even death with a strange, rebellious joy. Tombstones started bearing quotes like, "I told you I was sick," or "BRB. In one progressive Scandinavian village, mourners were encouraged to plant trees on graves that played a low, looping recording of the deceased's most iconic laugh every time someone walked by. Critics called it creepy. Locals called it comforting. This wasn't just culture evolving, it was biology adapting. Because the contagious laughter virus, while no longer medically virulent, had embedded itself in the social genome. People's brains had rewired. Our synaptic highways rerouted to make space for more levity, more openness, and more permission to be ridiculous. Therapists noticed it first. Patients who once avoided talking about their childhoods began giggling through the retelling of their most painful memories. Not because the pain was gone, but because they could finally see the absurdity of it all. The things they were told, the shame they carried, the absolutely bonkers way human beings try to love each other and fail magnificently. The virus, in its own strange way, had made us kinder. Road rage dropped by 60%. Partially due to the widespread use of car horns that now played clown honks or recorded laughter instead of aggressive beeps. Political debates remained heated, but now included mandatory irony breaks, where each candidate was required to read aloud an embarrassing journal entry from adolescence. Even global summits became less stiff, when leaders opened with personal blooper reels, It became hard to imagine bombing each other the next day. The military adapted too, albeit begrudgingly. Camouflage was replaced in some divisions by neon jumpsuits as part of Operation Stop Taking Yourself So Seriously. Drill sergeants were retrained to bark orders in pirate accents. Boot camp now included improv classes. War didn't disappear, but it became harder. It's surprisingly difficult to invade a country when your soldiers are laughing hysterically at their commander's failed attempt at interpretive dance diplomacy. But not everything was sunshine and satire. Some used the power of laughter irresponsibly. Disinformation campaigns started inserting subtle joke structures into propaganda, making lies more palatable. Authoritarian regimes weaponized irony to discredit dissenters. "Oh sure, we're the bad guys," they'd say, rolling their eyes so hard it became a national symbol. It turns out, when everyone's laughing, it's easier to hide manipulation behind a punchline. This led to the emergence of laughter literacy, a new discipline combining comedy theory, ethics, and critical thinking. Children were taught not just to laugh, but to ask why they were laughing. Who was the joke on? What was it covering up? Was it a mirror or a mask? It became the most popular subject in high schools, partly because the final exam involved dressing up as your least favorite politician and doing a roast. And through all this, scientists kept studying. One team in Japan discovered that certain types of laughter, specifically the wheezing kind that happens when you're trying not to laugh in church, activated a part of the brain associated with long-term empathy. Another group in Argentina found that laughter increased the body's ability to recover from trauma by as much as 40%. And a rogue Canadian researcher claimed that the frequency of genuine human laughter was disrupting surveillance AIs, which mistook it for audio corruption. In short, laughter was not just healing us, it was protecting us. Art, unsurprisingly, exploded. Comedians were now philosophers. Philosophers became clowns, and clowns became spiritual leaders. One traveling performance troupe, known only as the Giggle Cult, staged pop-up rituals in train stations where commuters were invited to scream laugh at their unpaid bills and lost dreams. It was cathartic. It was chaos. It was deeply, profoundly weird. And in the center of it all, one question echoed louder than all the chuckles combined. What is the point of a laugh, if not to say, "I see you, I'm with you, and yes, it's all ridiculous, but we're still here." And just like that, the world learned to live with laughter as both a mirror and a cure. Not every day was a riot of joy, of course. People still got heartbroken, still got fired, still stubbed their toes, and cursed the furniture. But even in those moments, especially in those moments, there was often someone nearby to let out a wheezy, ill-timed laugh that cracked the tension like a bad dad joke at a funeral. And somehow that was enough. In hospitals, nurses used humor as anesthesia, whispering absurd stories into patients' ears before surgery. In courtrooms, defendants could appeal for compassionate comedy, wherein their sentencing included mandatory sessions of stand-up comedy from local amateurs. Even prisons experimented with laughter rehabilitation. Inmates were given microphones and 5-minute sets every Friday night. It didn't fix everything, but recidivism rates plummeted among those who could make fellow inmates laugh without being stabbed with a toothbrush. And then came the ultimate test, the attempt to bottle it again. A biotech startup claimed to have isolated pure mirth DNA and offered a single-use nasal spray that guaranteed uncontrollable laughter for exactly 22 minutes. It sold out instantly. For 22 minutes, cities echoed with laughter so raw and violent it bordered on apocalyptic. But when the timer ran out, users didn't feel relieved. They felt hollow. Because manufactured laughter, like canned applause, doesn't come with a soul. The company folded. Their final press release read, "Turns out, the joke's on us." So what was the legacy of the laughter virus? It didn't destroy civilization. It didn't spark global wars or collapse economies. It didn't bring utopia either, but it did something stranger. It revealed us to ourselves, stripped away our stiff collars and brittle egos, showed us that the walls we build between each other, political, cultural, spiritual, crack just a little when someone snorts mid-sentence and can't stop. It made us uncomfortable, vulnerable, real. It gave us permission to be weird again. Not curated weird, not performative weird. The kind of weird that just is. like sneezing with your whole body or laughing until you wheeze because someone mispronounced quinoa as quinoa, and now you'll never be able to unhear it. And maybe that's what we needed most. Not perfection, not order, not some grand revelation, but simply the chance to feel together in a world that often insists we carry our burdens in silence. So if you've made it this far, congratulations. You've survived the great giggle plague. Or, perhaps more accurately, you've been permanently infected. Every awkward moment, every shared smile, every time you remember a joke 5 years too late and laugh in public like a lunatic, you're carrying the legacy forward, infecting others, not with disease, but with disarmament. And before we close this chapter of What If Horizons, remember, if you ever feel alone, overwhelmed, or like the world is spinning out of control, just find someone to laugh with. Doesn't matter what at. Could be a banana peel. Could be the absurdity of existence. Could be your own weird face in the mirror. Because if laughter is contagious, then hope is, too. Thanks for tuning in to What If Horizons, where we imagine the impossible, and sometimes the ridiculous, to remind ourselves why being human is the strangest, most wonderful thing of all. If you enjoyed this episode, help spread the joy. Like, share, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss the next beautifully bizarre thought experiment. And maybe, laugh a little harder today. Someone might just catch it.